We are now going to be talking about political parties. This topic, unfortunately, is one of the most divisive and misunderstood issues that we have in political science. So today we're going to look at and try to explain some of the challenges that we're having at this point in time. We'll talk about the role of political parties, our US two party system that we have compared to other nations that have multi party systems. We'll talk about why people identify with one party or why they do not, and the great paradox of why Americans embrace parties yet reject partisanship. We don't like the bickering, we don't like the straightforward non-negotiable, non ability to have some kind of debate about issues, just strictly voting partisan lines. We don't like that, but we have still kept hung on to our two-party system. So first, I'd just like to ask you all to make sure that you read the opening story in your book. It kind of gives you an idea of how political parties used to be up until about the 1990s. For a good many decades, we would have politicians go to Washington, whether you're Republican or Democrat. They would often have baseball games together, basketball games together. They'd go out and eat. Many of them stayed in Washington on the weekends, but as we'll find out when we discuss Congress, that's not the case now. Around the 1990s, when Newt Gingrich was in office, there became a great divide. He basically was quoted as saying, "You're not allowed to fraternize with the enemy." So they did away with any kind of bipartisan activities outside of their work. So, unfortunately, when people don't know someone else personally, it's harder to come to any kind of compromise. So it's we've seen that in a greater and greater divide of partisanship. So this chart here shows the percentage over the last 2 or 3 decades of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We're seeing more and more, as you can see by the black line, of people identifying as independents. And of course, these results are from public opinion polls that are taken year after year, just as we discussed in the chapter on public opinion polls. So here we have the two definitions, one of partisanship, which means taking the side of a party or espousing a viewpoint that reflects the political party's principle or position on an issue. So basically, always voting for a congressperson to always vote the party line, whether or not their conscience actually agrees with it or not. Um, and in bold, we have the definition of a political party. This is a group that shares political principles and is organized to win elections. That's a political party's main objective, is to win elections. Um, the presidency, obviously, any Congress positions, and also on state and local levels. So it is in bold. You will need to know that definition. So what do parties do? They do a variety of things. The first thing they do is they champion ideas. They create a brand that gives people an easy way to find candidates who roughly share their same views. They also help select party candidates. Um, the two major parties select their candidates to run for offices on almost all levels of government. Uh, and so that's one of their big duties. They also mobilize voters by raising money, hiring consultants, producing advertisements during election time, taking polls, and organizing phone banks. Then, once the elections are over, the parties organize governing activities after the election. So, once their leaders are elected and doing their job, then political parties will be responsible for contacting their members and asking them to call their call their representatives, whether it's their party's representative or their opposing party representative. Parties will encourage you to call your representatives on every issue that you possibly can. So that is something that hopefully by now you will have thought about for your discussion question that's about political participation. And then the fifth thing that parties do is they help integrate new groups into the political process. So we're starting to see this could be like for the Democratic Party, you'll often have union workers. So the Democratic Party will work with various unions to bring these groups into the same platform, the same ideas, and the same voting patterns as the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, you may see certain religions or maybe some business organizations, Chamber of Commerce, where the party leaders, excuse me, will work with these various groups. So they integrate new groups into the political process and get them motivated, mainly, first and foremost, to vote. So you can read more about the history of parties in your book, but just simply speaking, we are a two-party system. Even though we do have third parties, we're considered a two-party system for a couple reasons. And your book kind of talks about how Republicans and Democrats see uh, the role of government. And so Republicans see liberty as freedom from government coercion or government intrusion. Democrats emphasize freedom from want and support government programs that will ensure that everyone has their basic needs or the basics to be able to live. And then America has this first past the post style of elections. So whoever gets a majority of votes wins. Um, this is built into the Constitution, specifically when we talk about the voting of the president through the Electoral College. The winner of the presidency is a person who gets first past 270 electoral votes. The good news is that two-party systems have been predictable and stable, but a little bit less representative because you kind of drowned out any third parties or third ideas besides these two. So we're kind of stuck in the system, and we are at an interesting place in history because more so than ever there is discussion. There is a rise in independence. There's discussions about maybe the system isn't working for us. And I'd like to talk about this winner takes all part of the elections, especially for the presidency. So the winner takes all is whoever gets, each state gets to decide how their electoral votes will be cast. But almost all the states except for two, as we saw in the last lecture, follow the winner takes all system, which means that, for example, in Nevada, we have 6 electoral votes, and whichever presidential candidate gets 51% or over 50% of the total votes, even if it's 50.49% or something like that, 50 points something, that candidate gets all 6 electoral votes to be cast, because that's how the state of Nevada's electoral the two political parties have agreed upon. That part wasn't in the Constitution. Winner takes all is not in the Constitution. So that is something that could be changed to a more proportional vote where, say, for example, we have 6 votes, say 20% of the population votes for one candidate, or I think it was 40% and 60%. So 4 of our electoral votes would go to the person that got 60%, and 2 would go to the one that got 40%. That's called proportional representation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Also, um, your book talks about the GOP. This is in bold. You all need to know what the grand old party. That's referring to the Republican Party. It's a nickname that's been given to the Republican Party, but if you read any news articles or listen to the news, you'll often hear them refer to the Republican Party as the GOP. The Democratic Party grew out of the legislative faction that was aligned with Thomas Jefferson, and they were once known as the Democratic Republicans, and then they eventually split. We'll go over a little historical chart in a moment. So, your book talks about the advantages of a two-party system. Like we said, is that they're predictable and stable. So we haven't had a massive change in the way we do anything in 240 years. The disadvantage is that there's no room for third-party candidates, especially because of the Electoral College. So I've given you a video here that you can watch on your own. I would play it for you now, but it's long and it's a little bit boring. Just the way the guy speaks, but it's interesting to try to understand the winner takes all system and this new approach called the national popular vote. There is a campaign going on. Many states are trying to um, become a part of this national popular vote. This would be a law that basically says we can't do, you don't do winner takes all. I'm sorry. It basically says that there that your state has to give all of the votes to the candidate that got the national popular vote, which would bring your electoral college votes in line with the popular vote. There are a couple ways to solve this problem, and we'll talk about them at the end of this discussion. So third parties in American politics, there have been third party political presidential candidates, um, but none of them have gotten very far. They do better at the state level and local level. Minnesota elected a third party candidate governor. 4 other states have elected independent governors: Alaska, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine. And we have seen that when a third party becomes popular, if there's an issue that they make popular, usually one of the other parties tends to adopt it. So the Libertarian Party was really strong in many states of supporting legalization of marijuana. And then eventually the larger parties, actually, for the legalization of marijuana, believe it or not, both and if any of you watched the video that we had in the previous lecture on federalism, you will know that both the Republican and the Democratic Party are for the legalization of marijuana on the federal level. So we'll see what happens after this current administration is gone. So this chart shows the third party candidates back through history. You can see this is the percentage of the popular vote, and then in parentheses, it's how many electoral votes they had. Now we know that our current electoral votes are 538, but back in 1856, I'm not sure how many there were. So the one that made the biggest effect, so if you can see the percentage of the popular vote, was Ross Perot in 1992, got nearly 20% of the popular vote, which is huge for a third party. However, because of the winner takes all and not being able to get 51%, he got 0 of the electoral college votes. So this makes it very difficult for third parties, especially in the presidential race, to get anywhere beyond uh, just a notice. This chart shows the overview historically of the political parties. I don't think I mentioned this, but maybe I did on the Constitution. There's no mention in the Constitution of political parties. As a matter of fact, George Washington warned us against political parties and was not in favor of them at all. So in the very beginning, we kind of just had the Federalists, and those were the people that were for unifying the nation, all the colonies under one constitution and having a federal government. And then we had the Democratic Republicans who were of the Jefferson, who were more concerned about making sure that state rights were protected. Eventually, that party turned into the National Republican Whig Party, and the Federalists went away. I'm sorry, that party split to the Democratic Party and the National Public Whig Party, and then after that, they were just known as the Democrats and the Republicans after the Civil War. So, this second era here that you see in the chart. So, we'll just right now have a little. Let's see if I can get this introduction here so we get an idea of where we're at.
We're here at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and tonight Hillary Clinton will accept the nomination as the Democratic presidential candidate. A lot of voters upset with the Democratic pick are looking to a third-party option, but in the last 163 years, the president has been either a Democrat or a Republican. So how did the United States end up with this exclusive two-party system? Well, it's important to note that the U.S. has not always operated this way. During the first official presidential election, there were no political parties, and George Washington won without even campaigning. And in fact, most of the founding fathers were skeptical of political parties. In his famous farewell address, Washington argued that opposing parties would mercilessly seek to undermine each other at the expense of the American people. Nevertheless, by the time he left office in 1797, the country had split into two parties: the elitist and business-minded Federalists and a working-class Democratic Republican Party. This persisted until the mid-1800s, by which time the Federalists had dissolved and the Democratic Republicans had split into the modern Democratic Party and the new Republican Party. After a brief 20-year run as the Whig Party, the new Republicans evolved into just Republicans. So by 1854, the U.S. had what we know today as the Democratic and Republican parties. Their duopoly has persisted over the last century and a half, largely because of the country's unique first-past-the-post voting system. That is, each state has a set number of electorates, and whichever candidate gets the majority of votes, even by a fraction, wins all of those electorates. There is no reward for second place, and therefore little incentive to create a party that will get some votes but not the majority. For example, in the 1992 presidential election, independent candidate Ross Perot received nearly 20% of the popular vote and still did not garner a single electoral vote. The United States is one of just a few countries that has this first-past-the-post system. As a result, most other democracies see representation from more than just two parties. Japan, for example, sees representation from 5 major parties, as well as a number of minor parties, and in Israel, 10 parties or party affiliates are represented in the national legislature. That's because these countries use proportional representation to elect officials rather than a winner-take-all system. Many have argued that America's two-party system is unjust, not only because it limits voters' options at the polls, but because it encourages politicians to go to great, oftentimes shady lengths to grow their party. One example of this is gerrymandering. Because voters will ostensibly vote just one of two ways, policymakers can easily draw up and manipulate voting districts to favor their own party. The electoral system also creates an environment where parties aim to be as large as possible, even if it means absorbing ideas that don't necessarily square with their base. As a result, voters will identify less and less with their party over time. For the last 2 weeks, we've...
Okay. So, that kind of covered a couple things we have talked about in the last couple of lectures as well as just now. So hopefully you'll have that to review to help you study for your exam and understand mainly the Electoral College. I know it's a hard system to understand, so please review the videos. They always help out, as do the readings. Okay, so party identification and ideas. The party's goal is to gather people who identify with the same ideas, and usually the party will try to get people establish them at an early age. We're seeing more so that the younger generation is less likely to join a party or be affiliated with a party, as were our parents' or our grandparents' generation. Political socialization, we talked a little bit about that, how we get politically socialized, and oftentimes party loyalty runs through the families, but not always. I love to tell the story that my mother told me, was that as soon as she found out what her father's political party was, she just decided to become a member of the opposite party. So it doesn't always get passed down from generation to generation. But we do see through polling that Democratic Party tends to attract younger, more female, more diverse, more urbanites, and more secular people, where the Republican Party tends to attract male, white, suburbanites, people live in rural areas, white evangelicals, Mormons, etc. And but we are seeing a surge, like I said before, in independents. However, independents usually vote faithfully for one party or another. So you may call yourself an independent, but you often vote for usually one party or another. 12% of the population is considered to be true independents. And this chart is really good if you want to like look up some of your demographics, whether it's your age, your race, your gender. It kind of gives you an idea of the percentage of your demographics which are leaning towards either Democratic or Republican. Okay, so this slide shows three vocabulary words that you need to remember. Straight ticket voters. This would be at election time. For those of you who have already voted, you will know that there will be an R or a D or an I for independent in parentheses next to the person's name to help you know what party they're from, unless it is a judge, which we do vote for judges in Nevada. They will not put their political party next to it. But a straight ticket voter is someone who will just go in and vote straight the party. Right down the line, look for, if they're a Republican, look for all R's and just vote for the Republican candidates, or if vice versa, if it's Democrat, just look for all the D's. A split ticket voter is someone who will vote for whoever they believe is the best candidate. Last election, I canvassed and I went to several houses in my neighborhood, and I had someone running for state senator who was not in my party, but he was a friend of mine, and so I let him know later that the people that I canvassed for often said, "Oh yeah, we'll vote all the party except for we're going to vote for this guy because we really like him. He did a great job of going door to door, and he was a little bit more moderate candidate." So both parties ended up voting for him. So that would have been a split ticket voter if you voted for your party and then you switched over on this particular candidate because you like them. You voted a different party. And then the last term is base voters. This is for certain parties. These are people that they can always depend on these people to vote for them. These are people that have always voted their party and will always, and they don't have to worry about whether they're going to vote for them or not. So please remember those three terms in bold. Okay, the next couple of slides I'm going to go through pretty quick. I'd like you to look into your book and read about them. These are, I have a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 factions of the Republican Party and 4 factions from the Democratic Party. There are more, but your book talks about, and actually I think your book only talks about 5. They don't talk about populists on the Republican side, but I kept it in there because I think it's important with the current president to understand this type of voter. But these are factions within the party. These are groups of people with different ideologies. So within a party, you might have a lot of divisions. So they're not official party names or group names. They're just um, general ideas of these type of Republicans feel this way about this issue. So the first one is populists. They feel left behind by the changes that have happened. They feel like they've had their back turned on them, and they're usually strong nationalists. Um, the previous edition of the book called them populists or Trumpists. So there tends to be a lot that voted for Trump in the last election uh, under this type of faction. The religious traditionalists, they support a return to Christian origins. Very strong. Your book goes into more detail about them. Fiscal conservatives, these are people in the Republican Party who support tax cuts, oppose government spending, and identify that our huge deficit, it should be our main concern. Libertarians are strong defenders of individual liberty and promote minimal government intrusion into our personal rights. Neoconservatives, not a whole lot left in, a lot of them are of the older generation, but they support a strong U.S. intervention to spread democracy and free markets around the world. They believe that the U.S. is the world's only superpower and we should exercise our muscle to improve the world. And then moderates of the Republican Party are fiscally conservative but would consider tax increases along with spending cuts. They are relatively liberal on social and international issues. They sometimes support a combination of environmental regulations, gay rights, abortion rights, some kind of combination, gun control. So these are moderates on the Republican side. We move to the Democratic side. You have progressives. These would be similar to, let me go back to this slide, the populists, kind of extreme. Progressives are kind of extreme on the left, called left wing of the Democratic spectrum, and they're especially concerned with economic inequality. You could say that a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren would be on this spectrum. Civil Rights Caucus are people that are advocates for any kind of groups that have historically been faced discrimination in the past. Organized labor is pretty self-explanatory. They are a major source of have been a major source of campaign contributions for the Democratic Party, and they're concerned with labor issues and fair pay and minimum wage and things like that. And then centrists on the Democratic side, these are people that are left of progressives and but a little bit more fiscally conservative, like not quite as conservative as Republican conservatives, but these would be more like Republican moderates. So you have a centrist or a moderate faction in both Democratic parties, and it used to be that those were the people that could negotiate um, deals and be able to come to some compromise and be able to pass uh, big policies such as the Clean Air Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Clean Water Act, and a lot of our policies that have been passed in the past, and that we're having such a hard time passing big policies like that in our current environment, our current situation. So, these three slides and your book, I'd like you to review, and you will be asked a question on the exam to go into to explain. I'm not exactly sure, one, two, maybe three. I'll let you know when we get closer to the exam of these factions. Now, I don't want you to explain the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. I want you to talk about one, two, or three of these factions, and then also describe how you relate to them or you don't relate to them. And there's, like I said, there's more in your book, so go ahead and take a look at those. And then your book describes, so where we are now with political parties is that we have this competition and partisanship that is intensifying. And what it's bringing us to is gridlock in Congress. It slows down government's ability to get things done. It really breeds bad public policy. Many of you talked about in your introduction that you didn't like listening to politics because of all the negativity, and a lot of this comes from this partisanship where um, it's kind of mudslinging and negative campaigning. And unfortunately, it drives more public officials away from government service. Many have quit and because they just feel like they can't get anything done. And it leads to disenchantment from us. Nobody likes to listen to that. So it's unfortunate, and um, ideally, we would look for leaders who could try to change that. This last term here that's in bold, you need to know, it's called divided government. So, a divided government are periods which at least one house of Congress is controlled by a party different from the one occupying the White House. So, for example, up until the last election, we had the president was from the Republican Party, the Senate majority was Republican, and the House majority was Republican. That is not a divided government. A divided government would be what we have now, which is we have the House of Representatives is a majority Democrat, the Senate is majority Republican, and the president's still Republican. So that would be considered a divided government. So please be sure you understand what a divided government means. There will be a question on the exam, not just the definition, but an example. So you would have to know that. Either one of the houses or the presidency. So if a president is of one party and both House and Senate are of the same party, but different than the president, that's also a divided government. So one of the three entities has to be different for it to be divided. This chart in your book shows state by state. The blue or the red tiles show when both the governor and the state legislature's majority is of the same party. So we can look and see through the years, through the last couple decades, that Utah is on one end of the extreme, where that Utah has always had Republican governors and state legislatures majority of the Republican Party. And the other end of the extreme is West Virginia and maybe Maryland, where the majority of the time, not all the time like Utah, their governor and state legislature majority was Democratic. And we can look for Nevada. We're kind of right here in the middle. When they started this chart, we had a Democratic governor and majority Democratic. All the time since then, we go back and forth, so we don't have any majorities. And then 2014, we had a Republican controlled governorship as well as the state legislature. But this year, we've switched back to 2018, starting this year, 2019, we have a Democratic governor as well as majority in both houses in the legislature. As well as, I think I've already mentioned, but it's worth mentioning again, we have a majority of women in our legislature. We and the state of Colorado are the first two states to have that. So that's exciting. All right, the Electoral College. Okay, so this is a topic that is worth really understanding. So oftentimes in a face-to-face class, I get students that say, I just don't understand. Why do we have to have the Electoral College? Well, we have to have it because it's in the Constitution. In order to get rid of it, we would have to have a constitutional amendment. And in order to do that, if you've watched the lecture, listened to the lecture on the Constitution, we need 2/3 of the Congress to approve an amendment, and then we need 3/4 of all the state legislatures to approve it. So that's a big ask. But there are some other ways we can get rid of it. I started to explain a little bit about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and so we'll just watch a couple minutes here so we can all listen to
demonstrated once again the weakness.
Let's start that over.
The most recent election has demonstrated once again the weaknesses of the Electoral College. In 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and now in 2016, the winner of the U.S. presidential election lost the popular vote. Luckily for us, there is a way to get rid of the Electoral College, and it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The way that the compact works is pretty simple. It's an agreement between the states to bind the electoral votes to the popular vote. The beauty is that it only takes into effect once there are enough states that have joined the compact. In other words, once 270 electoral votes out of 538 have been represented within the compact, these 270 votes will be forced to vote whichever way the popular vote goes, forcing the winner of the election to follow the popular vote. This will remove all power from the Electoral College and return it back to the voters. There are three main benefits to abolishing the Electoral College. First, the candidate that gets the most votes should win the election. When we have a failure rate of almost 10%, where the winner of the election does not reflect the will of the people, we know that there's a serious problem with our system. This design is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. The second reason is that there's a disproportionate amount of focus given to swing states. For example, FairVote found that in 2004, more than half of the resources went to just Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. 18 states received neither visits nor TV advertising. In terms of TV spending, Florida's vote was worth $64,280,557, whereas California's was worth a big fat zero. California, your problems matter less than Florida's. The third reason is that voter turnout is lower in states that aren't swing states. People feel like their votes don't matter and just don't bother voting at all. This is an issue not just for the presidency, but for the down-ballot candidates and initiatives. We should be working to ensure that everybody's voice matters and that everybody's vote counts. You might think this sounds great but could never happen, but we're actually over 60% of the way there already. As of the making of this video, the compact has already been adopted by Washington, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, DC, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, making up 165 electoral votes. It's also pending legislation in Michigan and Pennsylvania, which make up another 36 votes. While we've made good progress towards enacting the compact, you may notice something in common with all of the states that have adopted it. They're all blue states. In order to make it all the way to 270, there will likely need to be some red or purple states that also adopt the compact. However, this isn't as challenging as you might think. 78% of Democrats support a direct popular vote for the president, along with 60% of Republicans and 73% of independents. This is a bipartisan issue with overwhelming support, and we can make it happen. That's why, with just 105 electoral votes left, it's important that we stay engaged in the political process. Hold your representatives accountable for their actions and let them know the issues that matter to you. There are other reforms that we need related to voting, which you can...
Okay. So basically, this other option is a compact between several states that are agreeing that they will give all of their electoral votes towards they will agree to give all their electoral votes towards the candidate that wins the popular vote. So for example, if in 2016, just say in Nevada that Trump got more than 50% of the vote, which he didn't, but if he did, and then Hillary got all of the the majority of the popular vote, even though Trump got more than 50% in the state, this agreement would make that state electoral votes have to go to the person that got the popular vote. Did that make sense? I hope. You can watch the video again just to, and there's a couple other videos that I've posted on this just so you can get a better understanding. There is a problem, however, that it will be challenged in court because it's an interstate compact, which means it's state to state are agreeing to something. And there is something in the Constitution called the Commerce Clause, which we've talked about earlier. But many scholars believe that it should not be contested in court. I mean, it can be contested, but it probably wouldn't. It's a possibility that it could be something that could change, but probably not by 2020. So we're stuck with the Electoral College for this next election. All right. So, in conclusion, I told you on the campaign and elections lecture that we're going to start looking at the problems and then talk about some solutions. So, some of the problems are winner takes all, and a reform for this. A solution would be to move to proportional representation. That's one of the suggestions for the Electoral College. Instead of doing winner takes all, give a certain percentage to one candidate and the percentage that they took. That's a little bit harder to do because you have to have a mathematical system in place, but not undoable. Reduce the barriers of third-party competition, so allow third-party candidates to be in the debates. That's something that could be easily changed. There's no law against it. It's just a matter of these two large political parties and the TV stations agree not to have a third-party candidate. Now, the problem with a third-party candidate is that when a race is really close, a third-party candidate takes away electoral votes, and it's possible that neither candidate can get 270 votes to win the election. Therefore, both parties are pretty headstrong about not wanting a third-party candidate in the debates. And debates are institutions where people can start hearing the voice of the other candidates in almost a fair setting, as opposed to just listening to advertisements from the person who has the most money to spend on advertisements. Reducing partisanship in government. Ideas include limiting negative campaigning, reducing the role of outside advocacy groups in campaigns, and adopting possibly public financing, which would be what we talked about last time, giving a certain amount of money to each candidate and saying you can't spend any more than that, and that money would be a set figure. And then, of course, the Electoral College is a problem, and the reform would be what we just talked about, the National Popular Interstate Compact, or a constitutional amendment, or new state laws, election laws, doing away with the winner takes all. All right, and then finally, from this section, what you'll need to know for the exams will be the definition of political parties, GOP, understanding the Electoral College system and its alternatives, knowing these terms, straight ticket voter, split ticket voters, and base voters, and reviewing the part on Republican and Democratic factions in your book. You should know what a divided government is, and that last side. And in your book, please review any reforms to challenges that we have in the political party system. All right, thank you very much, and see you at the next lecture.